law is clear on this matter, and justice will be served.
The frontier town of Dry Creek baked under the late summer sun, the dust curling along the streets like smoke from an unseen fire. Folks there lived by law and reputation, and no reputation mattered more than that of Judge Samuel Carter. A hard man, a church elder, and a landowner, his word carried more weight than the sheriff's badge. But even men who ruled others could not always rule their own house. His daughter, Clara Carter, was 20 years old, heavy-set, soft-spoken, and too often the target of her father's sharp tongue. In a place where women were expected to be slender, obedient, and desirable to suitors, Clara had none of those advantages. Whispers followed her in church pews and market stalls. Judge Carter's girl eats more than she prays, no man would have her. The judge's pride turned to shame. And shame, in a town like Dry Creek, was intolerable. One evening, after supper, Clara overheard the words that would mark the rest of her life. Sitting with his whiskey glass in hand, Judge Carter spoke coldly, "She's become a burden. No husband will take her. No family will claim her. Then let her live as a servant. Let her learn what hardship means." The next morning, he gathered the townsfolk to witness what he called a lesson in discipline. Clara was led out onto the courthouse steps, her face pale but her spine rigid. Beside her stood Ezekiel, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 30s who had lived half his life in chains of labor under the judge's estate. Though technically freed after the war, Dry Creek's rules bound men like him to service contracts that felt no different from slavery. The judge's decree rang out, "From this day forward, Clara belongs not to my house, but to Ezekiel's. Let her live as she deserves, under the roof of a man who knows toil and hunger." The crowd gasped. Some sneered at Clara, others pitied her. Ezekiel said nothing, his dark eyes locked on the ground. Clara felt the sting of humiliation burn deeper than the sun overhead. Yet, as she glanced at Ezekiel, she saw no mockery, no triumph, only a quiet sadness. By dusk, her belongings were thrown into a wagon, and she followed Ezekiel down the dusty road toward his cabin on the edge of the prairie. The judge had cast her away as punishment. But what neither he nor the townsfolk understood was that punishment can sometimes be reshaped into something the judge himself could never control. Like plus subscribe to follow this tale through to its end. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled across the prairie, the last traces of Dry Creek fading into the horizon. Clara sat stiffly, her trunk of clothes rattling beside her, her eyes locked on the dust rising behind them. The shame of her father's decree clung to her like the heat. Every whispered laugh in the crowd still echoed in her ears. Beside her walked Ezekiel. He didn't ride, though the judge had permitted him the horse. Instead, he walked, steady and silent, his long strides matching the plod of the animal. His silence wasn't the silence of cruelty, Clara noticed. It was something else, something heavy, like the land itself. By the time the sun bled into the prairie sky, they reached his home, a small cabin of weathered pine, tucked against a ridge where wind bent the grass flat. It was nothing like the judge's house with its polished floors and wide porches. Here, the roof sagged, the shutters rattled, and the earth outside was scarred with furrows of half-finished crops. Ezekiel held the door open. "It isn't much," he said at last, his voice low, steady. "But it's mine. And now, it's yours." Clara hesitated. No one had ever said those words to her, not even her father. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and iron tools. A single table stood near the hearth, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and shelves lined with jars of beans and dried corn. Spartan, but it was a place made by hands, not inherited like her father's estate. Ezekiel lit a lamp, the flame trembling. "You'll have your space," he said simply. "No man will touch you here without your word." Clara's chest tightened. She had expected derision, perhaps cruelty. But his words carried no mockery. They carried respect, something she'd never known. That night, Clara lay on the narrow bed, staring at the rafters. She thought of her father's cold decree, of the townsfolk's sneers. She thought of Ezekiel, his shoulders bent with labor, yet his words spoken with dignity. For the first time, the humiliation gave way to something unexpected. Not comfort, not yet, but a question. Could punishment become a kind of freedom? The prairie wind moaned against the shutters. Clara closed her eyes, the sound more lullaby than threat. For the first time in years, she drifted to sleep without the weight of her father's footsteps echoing through the halls. The judge had meant to break her. Instead, he had handed her to a man who had no interest in breaking anyone. Morning light spilled across Dry Creek, and already the town was buzzing. In a place where every whisper carried faster than the wind, the judge's decree had turned into a feast for the gossips. At the general store, women gathered by the barrels of flour, pretending to haggle over prices while their tongues cut sharper than knives. "Did you hear? Judge Carter's girl, sent off like livestock. Serves her right, too much pie and too little work. But to him? To Ezekiel? Hush now. Something's best left unspoken." At the saloon, ranch hands chuckled over their mugs. Imagine the judge's face, letting his own blood walk out with a man like that. Laughter spilled out, harsh and mean, until even the piano man shook his head in disbelief. By Sunday, the gossip seeped into the church pews. The pastor's sermon on sin carried a pointed weight, and though no name was spoken, all eyes slid toward the empty Carter bench. Clara's absence shouted louder than any hymn. Meanwhile, in the judge's fine house, silence reigned. He had no daughter now, only a lesson he thought he'd written into the town's memory. That even family could be sacrificed for pride. Yet, even as he sat at his polished desk, he felt the sting of unease. People did not look at him the same. Men respected his word less, women whispered about his cruelty. In trying to rid himself of shame, he had only fed it. Out on the prairie, Clara knew little of this, though she felt it in the way eyes lingered when she walked into town with Ezekiel to buy supplies. Heads bent together, lips curled, laughter tucked behind hands. Every step was a reminder of her father's decree. But what the townsfolk failed to see was the shift happening quietly in the cabin. Ezekiel treated Clara not as punishment, not as shame, but as someone worthy of space and dignity. He left a place for her at the table, asked her if she wanted the larger share of bread, listened when she spoke. Still, their stares burned her. She carried their scorn like stones in her pocket. One afternoon, as she stood in the mercantile, she heard a woman whisper, "She'll never be more than what he made her. She's nothing now." Clara's face flushed, but before she could turn, Ezekiel's voice cut through, calm but firm. "She's more than you'll ever know." The store went silent. Clara stared at him, words caught in her throat. For the first time, someone had spoken for her, not against her. The gossip swelled outside, like prairie wind rattling dry leaves. But inside Clara, something else stirred, a small, trembling seed of defiance, watered not by cruelty, but by unexpected kindness. Her father had given her a way to break her. Yet every whisper of scorn only sharpened her sense that perhaps, in Ezekiel's shadowed cabin, she was becoming more whole than she'd ever been in the judge's house. The days at Ezekiel's cabin began before sunrise. Clara had never woken to anything but the clatter of servants in her father's house. Now, it was the smell of wood smoke and the scrape of Ezekiel's boots at the door. He worked the land with quiet patience, mending fences, plowing soil hardened by drought, hauling water from the creek. At first, Clara stood uncertain, her hands clumsy, her dress unsuited to the grit of prairie life. She burned her palms carrying buckets, tore her skirts on brambles, stumbled when she tried to swing the axe. The judge's words echoed in her ears. "She's soft, useless, a burden." But Ezekiel never mocked her. When she faltered, he steadied her grip. When her arms gave out, he said simply, "Rest. Tomorrow, you'll last longer." He never raised his voice, never rolled his eyes, never reminded her of the decree that had thrown her into his life. Slowly, Clara began to change. She learned to split kindling with one clean strike, to knead dough with strong forearms, to carry her share of water without spilling. Her body, long the source of ridicule, became a source of strength she hadn't known it held. One evening, after hours spent repairing a sagging fence, she wiped the sweat from her brow and looked at the straight line of posts. The horizon stretched wide and golden, the prairie wind cool against her face. For the first time, she felt the satisfaction of work completed by her own hands. Ezekiel stood beside her, leaning on his hammer. "Your father gave you to me as punishment," he said quietly. But no one punishes by teaching someone how to stand taller. Clara swallowed, her throat tight. She wanted to speak, to tell him how his simple words cut deeper than any kindness she'd ever known. But the words stuck, and instead she only nodded. That night, over cornbread and beans, Clara caught herself laughing, an unguarded laugh that startled her as much as Ezekiel. For a moment, the shame, the gossip, her father's decree, all of it fell away. Yet even as she grew into this new life, Dry Creek did not forget. The whispers carried back to the judge, each one cutting his pride raw. And somewhere in the depths of her heart, Clara knew, her father would not let this stand forever. In Dry Creek, reputation was coin, and Judge Samuel Carter guarded his purse with fury. For weeks, he had carried himself with the smugness of a man who believed he'd erased a problem. His daughter was gone, and with her, the embarrassment of her body and her silence. But gossip in a frontier town was like wildfire. It drifted back to him through every saloon door and church pew. Men whispered that Ezekiel's cabin was no punishment at all. Women murmured that Clara had begun to walk into town with her head higher, her cheeks flushed not with shame but with pride. One evening, a rancher stopped him outside the courthouse and smirked. "Judge, seems your girl found herself more respect in a shack than she ever had under your roof." The words burned like acid. Samuel Carter returned home that night with whiskey on his breath and rage in his gut. He sat in his study, staring at the fire, gripping his glass until it cracked in his hand. His daughter, the one he had sought to bury in disgrace, was rising from it like smoke, and worse, she was doing so under the roof of a man Carter considered beneath even the dust on his boots. His pride twisted into something darker. He told himself it wasn't jealousy, it wasn't shame. It was justice. How dare she defy the order he had carved before God and town? How dare Ezekiel take what was never meant to be his? The judge's hand fell on the Bible lying on his desk. He opened it blindly, eyes landing on a verse about obedience and authority. He slammed it shut. "She's forgotten her place," he muttered. And so has he. The next day, in the Mercantile, Carter's temper snapped when he overheard two women whispering, "She looks healthier now." Almost happy. Happier than under his roof, that's certain. He stormed out, his boots pounding against the boards. By sundown, he had resolved that this humiliation would end. If Clara had grown a backbone in Ezekiel's cabin, he would break it. If Ezekiel thought himself a man, Carter would remind him what the law, and his fists, could do. That night, he summoned the sheriff to his house. They spoke in low voices, the lamplight catching the sneer on Carter's lips. By the time the sheriff left, Dry Creek's law had been twisted into the judge's weapon. Clara did not know it yet, but the father who had once thrown her away was not finished. His wrath had only begun to gather, like a storm creeping over the prairie, black and heavy, waiting to break. The knock came at dawn, heavy and deliberate, rattling the thin door of Ezekiel's cabin. Clara jolted awake, heart pounding, her hands still sore from the previous day's labor. Ezekiel was already on his feet, pulling on his shirt, his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. When he opened the door, the sheriff stood framed against the pale morning light, hat pulled low, badge glinting. Behind him, two deputies lingered, rifles slung casually but their eyes sharp. "Mornin', Ezekiel," the sheriff drawled, though there was no warmth in it. "Judge Carter's raised a complaint. Says you've taken what don't belong to you." Ezekiel's face didn't move. "She was given to me by the judge himself. In front of half the town." The sheriff spat into the dust. "Aye, that's what makes this messy. He says it wasn't proper, not legal. Claims you've held her here against her will." Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "That's a lie. I stayed because I chose to. No one's held me here." The sheriff's eyes flicked to her, then back to Ezekiel. "Choice don't come easy in this county, Miss Carter. Folks might say you're just scared to leave." Clara's cheeks burned, but before she could answer, Ezekiel spoke. "She ain't scared, and I ain't her jailer." The judge is twisting law to save his pride. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Careful how you speak, boy." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the cabin doorway, broken only by the wind stirring the prairie grass. Then the sheriff sighed. "I ain't here to drag her out, not yet. But the judge wants you both at the courthouse come Sunday. He's calling it a hearing." Ezekiel's shoulders stiffened. A hearing in Dry Creek was never just about law, it was about reputation, and the judge controlled both. As the sheriff tipped his hat and walked away, Clara felt her stomach knot. She had left her father's house under the weight of humiliation. Now he meant to drag her back into it, using the very law he claimed to uphold. When the dust settled and the cabin was quiet again, Ezekiel closed the door slowly. He turned to Clara, his eyes steady, voice low. "They'll try to shame us. They'll try to break us apart. But I won't bend." Clara swallowed, her throat dry. Neither will I. For the first time, she realized the truth. Her father had cast her into punishment, but here, in this cabin, she had found something he could never understand: choice and devotion. And that was precisely what he meant to destroy. Sunday came heavy with heat, the kind that pressed down on Dry Creek until even the dogs lay still in the shade. But the courthouse was alive with voices. Word had spread like wildfire. Judge Carter was bringing his own daughter and the man she lived with before the town. Folks packed the benches, fanning themselves with handbills, eager to taste scandal dressed as justice. Clara walked beside Ezekiel through the doors, her dress plain, her face pale but steady. Every eye turned, whispers fluttered like moths. Look at her, she walks taller now. She don't look shamed at all. Wait till the judge speaks. At the front, Judge Carter sat high on the bench, robes black as coal, his lips pressed into a thin line. To most, he was law incarnate. To Clara, he was the man who had cast her away like trash. The sheriff opened the proceeding, voice echoing. The matter concerns Miss Clara Carter, formerly of Judge Carter's household, now residing with Ezekiel Johnson. The judge claims her placement improper and unlawful. Today we'll hear testimony. The judge rose slowly, milking the silence. His words dripped with venom wrapped in piety. My daughter was never meant to dwell in such company. What began as discipline has become disgrace. This man, he jabbed a finger toward Ezekiel, has used deceit to hold her. I demand she be returned to her rightful home, where she can repent her errors. The crowd murmured. Some nodded. Others shifted uneasily. Clara's fists clenched. Ezekiel's turn came. He stood tall, sweat beading on his brow but his voice calm as stone. She was cast out, not asked, not guided, cast out like refuse. She came with me because she had no choice that day. But she stayed because she found one. No chains, no threats, no force. Just a roof, a table, and respect. The sheriff's brow furrowed. The townsfolk rustled, whispers sharper now. Then Clara stepped forward. Her heart thundered, but she raised her chin. My father speaks of law and discipline. But tell me, is there law in humiliation? Is there discipline in casting away your own blood for the crime of her body? He gave me up, not with kindness, not with prayer, out of shame. Ezekiel has shown me more dignity in weeks than I ever had in 20 years beneath that roof. A hush fell. Even the floorboards seemed to listen. Judge Carter's face turned crimson, his voice rising. You dare defy me in front of this town? Yes, Clara said, her voice breaking but clear. Because truth ain't defiance. It's freedom. The room stirred, a ripple of unease moving through the benches. For the first time, Dry Creek saw Judge Carter not as the unshakable pillar of law, but as a father whose pride outweighed his love. The sheriff banged his gavel. Enough. The court will deliberate. But as Clara met Ezekiel's eyes, she knew the judge wouldn't wait for deliberation. His pride had been cut in front of the whole town. And pride, on the frontier, was a thing men killed to protect. The courthouse emptied at dusk, townsfolk spilling into the street in small clusters, their voices carrying a mix of shock and thrill. Clara could feel the stares, some pitying, some quietly proud, others sharpened with malice. Dry Creek had never witnessed a daughter defy her father so publicly, least of all Judge Samuel Carter. As the crowd thinned, the judge stood in the shadow of the doorway, his black robe folded over one arm. His face was carved from granite, his jaw tight enough to crack. When his eyes met Clara's, she felt the weight of every year he had ruled her life pressing down again. You think this ends here? His words were low, meant for her alone. The law is mine, the land is mine, and you. You will regret every word you spoke today. Ezekiel stepped closer, his broad frame between Clara and her father. You had your say, now let her live. The judge's mouth curled into a bitter smile. Live? With you? He spat the word like poison. She'll never belong to you, boy. And if the law won't return her, I'll find another way. He turned sharply, his boots striking the boardwalk like gunshots, disappearing into the gathering dark. Clara's hands trembled. Ezekiel placed one calloused palm over hers, steady as stone. He'll come, Ezekiel said. But we won't run. Back at the cabin, the night pressed close, heavy with silence. Clara sat by the hearth, staring into the fire. She thought of her father's threats, of the years spent shrinking under his shadow, of the humiliation he had carved into her life. And she thought of the man beside her now, who saw her not as burden, not as punishment, but as something worth protecting. For the first time, she felt both fear and courage burning side by side in her chest. Fear of what her father might do, but courage that she would not go quietly into his darkness again. Outside, the prairie wind carried the faint creak of saddle leather. Men moving in the night. The judge was not waiting for deliberation. His vengeance was already on its way. Like plus subscribe if you want to see how this frontier tale of pride, punishment, and devotion ends. The prairie night was still, the air thick with the smell of mesquite and the faint rustle of dry grass. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly against the iron stove. Clara dozed in a chair, her head resting on her arm. Ezekiel sat alert by the window, sharpening a worn blade, listening to the silence like a man waiting for it to break. And break it did, the creak of saddles, the muffled snort of horses. Then, boots against dirt, moving slow, deliberate. Ezekiel rose, his jaw tight. He touched Clara's shoulder. Wake, she stirred, eyes wide as she heard it too. Figures moved outside, shadows sliding between the trees. Then a voice, cold and familiar, called from the darkness. Come out, Clara. This ends tonight. Her father. Clara's chest clenched. She looked at Ezekiel. He said nothing, but the calm in his eyes steadied her more than any words. The cabin door shook as fists pounded against it. You'll not shame me another day, the judge roared. Step out, or I'll drag you out. Ezekiel barred the door with a beam of wood, then guided Clara toward the back wall where the shadows gathered deepest. The deputies outside muttered, their boots crunching against the earth as they circled. You think you can defy law, girl? Her father shouted. You think that man can protect you? Clara's fear quaked inside her, but then she remembered the courthouse. The moment she'd spoken, the silence that had followed. For once in her life, her voice had mattered. She clenched her fists. Ezekiel spoke, his voice low but carrying. She ain't yours to command. Not anymore. The judge's laugh was bitter, hollow. She's mine by blood, by name, by God. And you, his tone sharpened like a blade, you'll be nothing but dust before the sun rises. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the scrape of rifles being cocked outside. Clara felt the weight of choice press against her chest. She could stay hidden, trembling as always, or she could step into the storm her father had brought. She took Ezekiel's hand, her voice barely above a whisper. If this is the night he means to end it, then I won't hide. Not again. The pounding at the door grew louder, the hinges groaning under the strain. Shadows pressed against the windows, lanterns flickering outside. The midnight confrontation had come, and there would be no turning back. The cabin door gave a final shudder before splitting at the hinges. Wood cracked, lantern light poured in, and with it came the shadow of Judge Carter, flanked by two men with rifles. His face was red with fury, his jaw locked in a sneer that masked pride, fear, and desperation all at once. Step aside, Ezekiel, he barked, or I'll see you buried before dawn. Ezekiel didn't move. He stood tall in the doorway, broad shoulders blocking the men behind him from stepping inside. His eyes never left the judge's. You gave her to me, he said evenly. And I've given her nothing but respect. That's more than you ever did. The judge's hand twitched toward his coat, but before he could speak, Clara stepped forward from the shadows. Her heart pounded, yet her voice rang clear in the night air. Stop this. Her father's head snapped toward her. Clara, you will return to my house this instant. Enough of this nonsense. You are mine by blood and name. Clara trembled, but she did not lower her gaze. No, I was never yours. Not when you shamed me. Not when you cast me away in front of the town. You lost your right to call me daughter when you chose pride over love. The words landed heavier than any bullet. The men behind the judge shifted uneasily, their rifles lowering slightly. Even Ezekiel's breath caught, hearing her speak with a strength he'd only glimpsed until now. The judge's face darkened, his voice breaking with rage. Ungrateful girl, you defy me before these men, before God? Clara's reply was steady, cutting through the prairie silence. I don't defy God. I defy you. The night hung still. The deputies exchanged glances, their loyalty faltering. For years they had bent under the judge's word, but in this moment, they saw not justice, only a father undone by his own cruelty. Ezekiel took Clara's hand, stepping forward just enough to shield her, but he didn't need to say anything. Her words had already broken the hold her father had carried for 2 decades. The judge's voice cracked into silence. His fury had no purchase, his pride no audience. At last, with a sound that was half a curse and half a groan, he turned on his heel. The men followed, their lanterns swaying as they vanished into the prairie night. Clara stood frozen, her hand trembling in Ezekiel's, her chest heaving with the force of what she had done. She had not needed a weapon. Her voice had been enough. As the cabin grew quiet once more, Ezekiel looked at her, his eyes filled with something that was not pity, not mere duty, but devotion. "You're free now," he said softly. Clara's tears came hot and sudden, not of shame, but of release. For the first time in her life, she wasn't bound by her father's decree, nor by the whispers of Dry Creek. She was her own. The judge had cast her away as punishment. Yet in the end, that punishment had become her salvation.